With the Dacians destroyed, we had to look elsewhere for support against the Macedonians. Glaucus and the fleet by themselves wasn't enough, but just across the Aegean, Pergamon, a city-state that was part of this otherwise profitable trade league in the east, now found it more lucrative to confederate into our vast trade network throughout the Western world. They were already at war with Macedon and some other nation in the Far East, so their decision was sound. With the Confederation of Pergamon, there was only one settlement left in order for us to secure hegemony over the Aegean seas. Another member of the Trade League, the Bithynians. Agamedes, a Pergamene commander, was presently marching through that region on his way north, along with a formidable army known as Athena's Faithful. Quite fitting, although it would take time before they actually reached the front line. They were now marching for Dacia to enact justice for our fallen allies. In the meantime, over in Gallia, after a prolonged blockade, our two fleets, led by Porphyrius, were at last ready to assault the Massalian capital. To be honest, the city was rather beautiful and well engineered in the sense that they took advantage of this natural river and higher ground to form rather difficult obstacles to overcome. On the other hand, this also brought a few opportunities. After blasting through multiple guard towers on both sides of the dividing river, we prepared to land with our massive fleet both inside and outside of the city to split up the defending garrison. While we were trying to breach their walls, a minor regiment attempted a preemptive attack against our forces, but failed and thus accidentally revealed the biggest obstacle during this entire assault: this wooden bridge. As soon as the walls were down, we launched the attack with both arrows and javelins flying everywhere, with our marines splitting up to both outflank enemies and protect the rear of fellow Athenians. Inside the port itself, we needed every man we could afford, as this was where the Massalian cavalry continuously frontal charged our spearless marines, causing absurd amounts of casualties on our troops. After realizing the eastern assault wasn't going as planned, we blasted another hole in the walls for a minor marine unit to breach through, and thus getting in behind the Massalian lines to attack them from the rear, causing the Massalians to partly fall back to the river. However, by this point, our elite seafaring marines at last managed to cross the daring wooden bridge, resulting in us basically outnumbering the garrison inside the main part of the city. This allowed our troops to take control of the various streets, larger bridges and towers, meaning these retreating Massalian forces just ran straight into our marines. The city was ours. As a precaution and also a bit of revenge, we razed the city to make sure the Massalians never would recover again, even if they recaptured the city. In some foolish hope, they named Narbo as their new capital, as if it wasn't our next target. A blockade was immediately established with a smaller army from Iberia, namely the one that defended our copper mine from the Iceni, now marching for Transport Gaul to ensure Athenian hegemony over that province. The following summer we captured the port along with the olive gardens of Tolosa, supported by the stout defenders of Diospolis. We had now successfully split the Massalian nation in two with only one port left. It was too close to Rome for us to dare an assault, but in the grand scheme of things it didn't matter. The Massalian oligarchy was stuck in Gaul without access to sea trade, meaning our naval strategy was doing its thing to perfection. Further north, the already isolated Iceni were by now left with just 3 towns, and we had 3 armies to go for each one at the same time. But first we had to deal with this rather well-equipped Britannic force. Although our men at this battle only had a fraction of the same armor, our cunning tactics proved to be the deciding factor. Our lesser army caught the attention of the Iceni forces engaging in a rather fierce struggle. This allowed our more stealthy units from Britannia to sneak in behind the hostile lines and cut down this raiding party. Our casualties were expectedly quite high, but with a quick rest inside our own lands, our armies would be ready in no time. If only it was that simple, as an additional army marched forward, forcing us to retreat. We had to wait for reinforcements to arrive. The middle town was also rather heavily defended, meaning that breakthrough had to come from Germania, which it did. Our other army fled all the way back to Eurobona to stay guarded and replenish. This proved to be vital as the Iceni thus overextended, allowing us to defeat their second major army. This was slow progress, of course, but I would rather take that than a treacherous trade partner who we granted independent rule that declared war upon our Punic allies over some ancient territorial dispute. Because of our support to Carthage, they sacked Heraclion and almost did the same to Artemida, if not for our heroic defense. Another war had broken out in Iberia. Zenobius, who probably still mourned the death of his wife, once again was destined to return to Iberia and finish off this barbarian threat once and for all. He wasn't alone in this endeavor, with the now legendary Cleisthenes seizing control of Brigantium, leaving the Titani without food or shelter. A great feat for the veteran who was among the pioneers that sailed from Greece to these unknown lands in the west. After spending the season raiding their former homeland trying to survive, they decided upon fighting one last battle to the death, where Cleisthenes had to use every tool available to survive. After discovering the Titani fleet tried to land and link up with their ground forces, we sent forth our ships to ram them down one by one. The ballista ships made the whole process a lot easier too, as they just shot down any ship protected by any nearby wreckage, although the fire also harmed our own ships. After that, the ships returned to port, where a massive storm of arrows was harassing the Iberians that had seized control of the town. Their numbers rather quickly dwindled courtesy of our ranged advantage. Whereas the Titani began burning our flagship, Cleisthenes was forced to land with the other marine units, putting him in huge danger, especially as the ballistae weren't always all that accurate. Nevertheless, he barely survived the struggle, meaning Cleisthenes single-handedly now had occupied the entire western coast of Iberia and Gaul, apart from New Athens, of course. The eastern coast of Iberia, on the other hand, was all claimed by Porphyrius, who, unlike the last time we defeated Massalia, saw the importance of a unified Iberia under Hellenic rule and thus captured the town, instead of liberating it like Isocrates once did in the past. This left the Orytani with one minor settlement at the heart of Iberia. Zenobius was the only one in position to reach it. After crushing one army at Heraclion, along with the fleet in ruins, Zenobius slowly crept up on the Iberians, replenishing his forces along the way, until he finally caught the Orytani off guard and pacified the Iberian peninsula for good. Over in Greece too, the story was similarly tedious. The lost Macedonian fleet was raiding the trade ships sailing through the Aegean. Something had to be done, so we called for the nearest fleet, the one in the Adriatic, to sail back home and inevitably sink the Macedonian fleet, allowing our valuable trade to keep flowing. Sadly, this was at the cost of whatever pressure we had on the Roman ports in Italy, allowing them to muster a grand fleet strong enough to invade Greece and take Apollonia. By this point, Glaucus had already left Pella in favor of hunting down the last Macedonians, just like Archimedes the Pergamonian, who had engaged the enemies in Dacia. So it all came down to our lone fleet in the east to sail straight back to the Adriatic. Of course, it was clear that by the size of the Roman fleet it couldn't have been built in Italy during the short time we were gone, but perhaps Sicily or Africa instead. Due to this uncertainty, we called for one of the fleets who fought against the Massalians to sail for Sicily and capture both Panormus and Akragas. After reviewing the wharves established here, it was evident this was where the Roman fleet originated from. So with this conquest and no Roman armies able to retake them without sailing through our fleets or dealing with our beachhead in Magna Graecia, all we had to do if we wanted to secure hegemony over the Western Mediterranean was defeat this damned fleet. Against the odds and on low supply, our fleet engaged the Romans. However, right off the bat, the battle was decided. After not having experienced any resistance against the Romans at sea, we just formed up in two simple lines. But the Romans, however, this time had a plan. As we sailed forward, the Romans split up their columns, trying to outflank our fleet. Our marines, of course, were more skilled in ramming and simply destroyed the Romans on impact, but the large amount eventually actually got stunned, allowing the Romans to take down many of our ships. After discovering the travesty that was at hand, the Athenian fleet withdrew back to Crete, leaving Apollonia in the hands of Rome. This wasn't all bad though, because if not for this attack and the many Roman ships we destroyed in our initial charge, the Romans would have been able to occupy Epidamnos as well. But now we were able to defend it, smashing this once great Roman fleet into bits. Our army at Taris would shortly thereafter sail back to Apollonia, recapturing it, just to return back to Magna Graecia, waiting for the right moment to strike. We had successfully dismantled the Roman naval presence, and by the same time mobbed up Macedonian outposts in Dacia, with both Glaucus and Archimedes liberating the local tribes to do as they wished. Antigonus Gonatas was still at large, roaming the countryside. In an act to decide his own fate, he, along with whatever loyal forces he still had under his command, marched for the now Athenian-occupied city of Delminium in Illyria, where he made a hopeless last stand. With him gone and the Macedonians destroyed, Gaul was the only area left outside Latin influence with Roman allies. It was of course Massalia and the Iceni, and for some reason also the Sequani, who I more than anything believe were allies of the Iceni rather than anything. As a matter of fact, the Sequani were the only ones standing in the way of us defeating the Iceni, mainly due to their army being stronger and less exhausted from battles like ours were. But to our fortune, we had another army lurking nearby for ambushing opportunities. So as the Sequani didn't realize the danger they were in, we attacked, taking down this army from both sides. This didn't mean we could march on the Iceni settlement, but rather return to our own settlements where a smaller elite Iceni army was invading us. But our retreat wasn't hasty enough, as the Iceni attacked, causing quite a lot of issues for our lesser equipped garrison. But thanks to our clever usage of the terrain and layout, we managed to occasionally bunch together the attackers, making effective usage of our archers and slowly falling back to more favorable defensive positions where our larger numbers had a more meaningful impact, allowing us to barely win the battle. So instead, our two armies chose to take down any other minor Iceni raiding party within our lands and replenish in the process. This was basically the ever-continuing story of this almost trench warfare-like conflict over Gaul, where after every battle both sides suffered too many casualties to get an edge over the other. Nevertheless, we never gave up, with this new army mixed of both Iberian and Gallic troops marching into the undefended city of Nemosas, forcing the Massalians to withdraw their government all the way up to the walled city of Bibracte. This was of course the fourth active army operating in Gaul, making this by far the most intense part of this conflict apart from what the Mediterranean was until recently. After our little attack, the Massalians immediately made a massive counterattack, and probably the most cursed defensive battle I've ever fought, but still narrowly edging out a Pyrrhic victory in the end. Down at the city of Massalia, we also had a fifth army stationed, but it was kept in reserve for an upcoming invasion and potential occupation of Italy that would begin once Glaucus arrived in Cisalpine Gaul. After his little detour in Dacia, he was by now on his way, and once he reached the province, we swooped in to capture Genoa. The Pergamonian army led by Archimedes was also expected to participate in the invasion from the south, but unexpectedly had to stay in the east as the Scythian nomads suddenly launched raids into Thrace, taking Odysseus and our trained slave resource along with it. It didn't take long for us to establish an agreement of shared land in the province, but kept this army here to deter other scheming tribes considering taking advantage of our larger conflict in the west. I mean, one army in the south seemed enough by itself, as it at last was allowed to march for Cosentia, meeting Roman armies on the field of battle. Here our Cretan archers showed their supremacy over the Roman slingers, before the two lines crashed together in a major bloodbath. Once locked together, our Illyrian raiders flanked around, through their pillars and then charged in with their axes, breaking the Roman lines, just like Glaucus did at Octavium in Cisalpine Gaul. It was the same flanking concept, but with a more sturdy Hellenic core of units and a few Thracian falsmen to run around the edges. No matter the differences in army setups, the results were the same: decisive victories and further Athenian control over the Roman world. After some more back and forth conflicts, we finally captured another Iceni settlement, meaning we began eyeing up this Belgate town, the last hideout of the Iceni. However, it was once again defended by the annoying Sequani, who continuously obscured our progression. If we wanted the Iceni destroyed, we needed all our armies available. Massalia had to fall first. So we sent out one army down towards Lamonum, and after we captured Mallan, forced two other armies into the dangerous Alps, from where they would take down these hideouts defended by natural terrain, leaving the Massalians with the walled city of Bibracte. Over in Iberia, the Romans for one last time tried to bribe the locals to rise up against us, but was repelled at the walls, leaving the only way out of this conflict in their own hands. So as our southern invading army was down in Sicily to secure the former Greek colony of Syracuse, the first place we actually met the Romans fighting Carthage, the Roman legion stationed at Rome marched for Terrace. At haste we marched north, and thankfully due to our naval advantage we were able to sail into the port to reinforce, and thus deter a potential attack for another season, allowing our armies to eventually break the siege. After this we stormed the city of Bibracte with 3 separate armies uniting in a single attack to defeat the Massalians for good. At the same time, Cleisthenes, who by now had returned to the Mediterranean, launched an attack on the Romanized city of Carthage along with Porphyrius. However, the two conquerors of the Iberian coastlines received a massive surprise by the fact that the city of Carthage was nowhere near like the city described by our Punic allies. This forced our otherwise battle-ready fleet into a 50 days assault, slowly breaking down the now Romanized defenses just to be cut down once the ground assault began. This was a shameful display of the highest order, something the now old and stubborn Cleisthenes wouldn't accept. He and Porphyrius cooked up a plan of Porphyrius distracting the Roman armies along the coastline, while Cleisthenes led a covert mission into the city supply depot, where they would try to set the Roman supplies on fire, forcing them to abandon the walled city. However, this was quickly discovered, with Cleisthenes and his men gradually being forced to break off to keep away the Romans trying to defend the supplies, eventually resulting in the death of this legendary admiral. After hearing of this travesty, Porphyrius called off the attack, fleeing back to Sicily. This was a catastrophe for the Hellenic world, especially politically, where the party Cleisthenes formerly led now was in outroar, demanding justice upon the other Athenian elites. Securing loyalty wasn't enough. If we didn't solve this issue, the entirety of Iberia would break off, starting another civil war. Not to forget the many armies that politicians commanded throughout the realm, many of whom were either in Gaul or Italy. There was only one way to solving this situation, and it required Gaul. Lots of gold. There was only one option left to avoid disaster: loot the last Iceni settlement or face the biggest setback imaginable. This was probably one of the most important battles of this entire campaign. The Hellenic realm relied upon this inferior army defeating the vast Iceni numbers. It was time to focus. Knowing our army had no holding power to perform hammer and anvil maneuvers like we were doing in Italy, we had to make sure we absolutely crushed one flank so decisively that it caused a tidal wave of units to fall upon one unit at a time, and thus maybe get a Pyrrhic victory. But it was time to ride out. By some miracle, we had won the day. This looting and destruction of the Iceni granted us enough resources to promote almost every politician in the Erechis party. Furthermore, we had to pay for dozens of marriages to the former children of our own party's elites, who had abandoned our political views in favor of renown elsewhere. This was really humiliating, but it had to be done to avoid disaster. In the grand scheme of things, this victory over the Iceni symbolized the fall of the last Roman supporting faction, leaving the devious traitors divided, isolated and alone. Apart from the annoying Sequani, of course, but they were defeated courtesy of our Germanic trade partners. The isolation of Italy and the city of Rome itself forced the Senate into action. They mustered an entire army out of thin air and were now marching south to re-establish the connection between Italy and the armies of Africa. However, whenever they tried to force a decisive battle, we simply retreated, waiting for the armies of the north to enter Italy through the Alps. But by some dumb luck miracle, we caught one of the newly raised armies all by itself. I guess they didn't expect an Athenian army to be hiding in the nearby forest. But once they realized we were here, they honorably marched to fight us, perhaps in an act of overconfidence. Nevertheless, the trees massively obscured any tactical maneuvering, which thus favored the Roman legion. Our men were desperately holding on, with many of our troops failing to dodge the Roman gladiators. Eventually, however, we managed to get an edge on the Latin Republic. With that victory, the northern invasion began. Glaucus gave the orders to desolate these lands, razing everything to ash, allowing slums to form in whatever rubble that was left. The Roman legions desperately tried to force another battle, but once again allowed us to divide and defeat their forces. Italy was completely destroyed. All the Romans had left was the former homeland of the Carthaginians. After having failed to take Carthage once and suffered the consequences for it, we now prepared a grand invasion from Sicily. The Egyptians were in on it too, with them seizing Thapsus. We, on the other hand, invested 3 complete fleets to blockade and safeguard the voyage, along with 3 additional ground armies to take on the towns further inland. Glaucus wasn't part of this invasion though. Instead, he stayed in Italy, making sure no Roman tricks could deceive us here again, and also signed the agreed military alliance with the Bithynians, officially securing the Aegean under Athenian or allied influence. The Romans, fearing the mighty armies coming for them, now abandoned Carthage in favor of defeating the Egyptians one last time. This meant our fleet could just swoop in and take the town, while our other armies marched inland. The Romans actually managed to counterattack, destroying the 2 fleets garrisoning Thapsus, but by this point it was too late. Our armies had overrun their last bastion, taking everything in the name of Athena. The Mediterranean War was finally over. We had redeemed our actions against the Carthaginians, who now served as a crucial ally, policing the maritime trade lanes against piracy. By the year 232, the age of colonization was over, because not only had we established colonies in the west, but also fully Hellenized the entire land. Of course, not everyone were willing to convert to our ways, demanding our armies to be stationed throughout our grand realm, many of whom were stationed in either Britannia, Gaul or Thrace, as the barbarian tribes beyond our borders also had begun looking at our larger trade network as a potential source of wealth. This was of course a concern, as our own trade routes greatly surpassed the ones of the Eastern Trade League. With the common enemies in Rome now gone, the Galatians, who ruled most of Anatolia, called for action, declaring war, pleading their allies to help in this endeavor. This was a war that desperately needed the likes of Cleisthenes, Glaucus or Zenobius. But shortly after the war, both Glaucus and Zenobius fell incredibly ill, dying of old age. Most remarkable was the fact that neither actually seized the opportunity after the previous civil war to proclaim themselves emperor, instead favoring the democratic system Athens had been ruled by for years. Nevertheless, these heroes from the age of colonization were now gone, marking the end of this generation. It was now up to the upcoming politicians and leaders to lead Athens in this new war of the Eastern Mediterranean. A new generation of heroes whose tale will be told another time. But until then, goodbye.